Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Ronny Blaschke, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Ronny Blaschke. Ronny, how are you doing? Thanks very much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rory. Hi, how's it going?
It's going well, thanks very much. Some of our listeners might already be familiar with you and your work. As far as I'm aware, you've released 2 books with Pitch Publishing so far. The first one, Power Players, Football and Propaganda, War and Revolution, and the second one, which was pretty recent, Football and Racism, How Colonialism Shaped the Modern Game. And that's really what our conversation today is going to focus around. Power Players was probably it is one of my favourite football books that I've read, and I can guarantee a number of our listeners will also have read it as well. Whereas Football and Racism, I still need to pick up and read, but it touches on a number of themes that I'm quite keen to discuss with you and that are quite important when we talk about themes like power, football, politics, and the way that both football clubs, their supporters, and governments actually use football and different heritages to achieve their own means. So it's going to be a good discussion. We're going to touch on quite a lot of topics today, so we've got quite a lot to get through, but I'm looking forward to it nonetheless. Just before we kick things off properly, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, first of all, and the other work that you do?
Yeah, I'm a journalist almost now for 20 years. I'm based in Germany, and I started as a classical football journalist because I wanted to be close to my favorite club, which is Hansa Rostock, which is in the north of Germany, now in the 3rd division. But after a few years, it was a bit boring for me just covering the results, the victory, and the losses. So I brought my biggest interests together, which was football and politics. And yeah, the stadium and football is a pretty good platform to explain political and historical topics. And to this day, it's a privilege to do this and to travel and to meet interesting people. And with a lens of football, explaining politics, society, and history to me, and I translate it to the audience. So this is the model of my work, and so far it's working pretty well.
Yeah, living the dream. I mean, we've spoken with a couple other people on the show before. Kit Holden, when we done the episode on Union Berlin, and John Williams, a professor of sociology. That was quite a recent episode where we speak about this idea of, the stadiums being these hubs where different expressions are made and different things happen, but also how you can talk about things like society and wider themes like politics, how society interacts with each other. You can do that through football, and that's what's really important and powerful about it for me. And that's one of the conversations that we're going to be having today, is essentially around this idea of power within football, how it's expressed itself over the years and how it manifests itself in the stadium. So we'll just get right into it. We've kind of touched on this briefly in an episode towards the end of last year with the guys from the Football podcast. What do we mean when we say power? Because I think it's quite interesting within the context of your book, which is obviously called Power Players. And I think some people might just read that and kind of shrug it off as just being the title. But I think it has a very, very specific meaning when we talk about this idea of power, doesn't it?
On the one hand, it is a broad term, right? Maybe power is a synonym for football. And for me as a journalist, I try to find very concrete examples. And I have the book Power Players right in front of me, and just looking at the content, you have so many examples. For example, if you look at the Balkan Wars, right? Red Star Belgrade, where football fans recruited hooligans, sending them as warriors and fighters into war. That is one interpretation of power. More recently, Syria, the civil war, where the dictator Bashar al-Assad used the stadium not only as a parking spot for tanks or as a prison for the opponent. No, he used the stadiums as a place for firing rockets against the enemies. And you can go from a government, from fans, from clubs. Football is power, right? And so it is a very broad topic, but for me, I was always like looking for the smaller story, which explains then the bigger topic. But Power Players, I think it's a good title for football in general and for the industry. And interestingly, the football industry does not really admits that. So they want to be influential. They want to be a good tool for society, but they don't really want to admit that governments, regimes, dictators misuse football for their power. So it fits only their logic. But we as journalists, or you as a critical podcaster or scholars. We have to explain it and we have to make it more clear.
Yeah, that's correct. It's interesting when we talk about it, and like you mentioned too there, it's almost as it's a bit like the elephant in the room, isn't it? And one of the examples we'll come on to touch on, particularly during the Arab Spring, fan groups really leveraged the power that they have within football to make change happen. Whereas in certain other cases, it's almost like an underlying thread that runs through football where different organisations, different clubs, different groups will use their power without openly admitting it or doing it in a very indirect fashion. So within that, where is it that football actually gets its power from? Because this is quite a big discussion as well. It's obviously something that's evolved over time. Any kind of event, whether it be a concert, organisation, political movement, or otherwise, through the kind of idea of the mob and loads of people engaging with it, obviously, gains power in some form or another. But football, because of its longevity and consistency, has almost been able to legitimise its power, as well as the people that come along and support it. So, in your mind, where is it that football actually gets this power from?
I mean, very simple. It's a very cool sport. No, it's a fabulous sport. It's popular among all groups of society. It's easy to understand, and for almost 150 years, even more, it was successful. And sometimes when we talk about football and we try to intellectualize it and we find smart definitions of football, very often football is a powerful tool, but the people that are using this tool, they're not really aware of it. If you would ask them, how would you define it? They could not give you an answer. I was in Morocco recently. I was in Casablanca. Morocco will host the Africa Cup of Nations later this year in December, and they will be one of the hosts of the World Cup 2030. I was looking at this very passionate derby in Casablanca and the ultras using football. They were not as critical or political as in Egypt or in other places of the Middle East or North Africa, but the fact that they were meeting each other, networking, creating meeting spots, fact that they were feeling stronger together, they had a sense of belonging, and with that sense of belonging, they were maybe networking or maybe creating labor unions, maybe joining a party. Football is then a starting point for people, mostly young men, that weren't organized before. And this you can see now in Morocco, for example, but you could see that in India 120 years ago or in Egypt 60 years ago. So the setting of football, the emotions, the fun, so political topics don't feel that political with the help of football. That makes it easy. But it makes it easy to infiltrate as well from political powers that we might not agree with.
Yeah, it can be used either way. There's a lot of different actors at play when we talk about power in football, particularly when we talk about fan movements, and fan movements in particular, which have ended up taking large roles within revolutions, or in the case of the Balkans, civil wars as well, which you touched on. That's just one of the ways that power plays a role in football, but there's so many others, some that we might not realise, as you touched on, some that the people actually using it might not realise as well, and it can be forms of soft power and hard power. It can be anything from your club deciding that a certain demographic of supporter aren't allowed in anymore by raising the prices of tickets, or it can be anything from having fans kettled outside the ground if they're an ultras movement and not allowing them in or having them patted down. So that there's loads of ways that power is actually used in football in really small and almost kind of day-to-day ways. Are there any other ways, kind of really prominent examples that you can explain the role of power within football that just might give our listeners a little bit of a better idea of what it is we're talking about here?
Yeah. In power plays, I describe many examples how, for example, the president of Egypt or other people use like the very visible platform of a stand, presenting themselves and introducing themselves as the fathers of society, because with the help of football, they can reach out to everyone. More recently, the last 10, 15 years, it's more organized maybe. If you look at China, which 5, 10 years ago before COVID everyone was telling us China will be the new superpower of football. They wanted to have the World Cup. They gave back the Asian Cup. You can use football as a tool without even organizing matches or without being present in the stadium. I did a story on the so-called stadium diplomacy. So China is financing stadiums in Africa, more than 100 so far, giving cheap loans or building them, sending experts to build these stadiums. Why? Because in some African nations, the governments can prevent themselves. The stadium is a prestige building. And China does not do it only because they are nice people. They would like to have something right. They want to have resources, they want to have raw materials, rare earth, and maybe they want to persuade some African nations to support China, not Taiwan. So it's a very strategic geopolitical tool now for the superpower of China. And and we can go to, or the Silk Road, right? This network of trade in Asia and Africa. And football is a very visible tool, easy to understand. And the stadium, which is very visible from afar in a city, can help. This is only one example, but it is strategically used and has to be well prepared.
Yeah, China well, they've got previous for that, obviously, within the Middle East as well, and Yemen and Lebanon, I think, as well, where they funded quite a lot of social projects and actually contributed to building the stadiums. So that's a really good example, actually, and I quite like that one, is how these superpowers leverage political power and use these projects and loans to actually, as you kind of mentioned, and I think is quite a good term for this, infiltrate their way into different societies so that they can garner support against whatever cause that might be. And I guess this is what kind of comes on to your latest book that came out, and where I wanted to touch on colonialism. And colonialism within football is really interesting to me, particularly where nation building is concerned. From a heritage perspective, there's a lot to be discussed there. But when I was thinking about this conversation with you in the context of power, obviously, power is used within football on an almost day-to-day basis, and we can see loads of little examples of it just through our weeks and through the different developments that happen through football in one particular season or year. But in terms of colonialism, is its lasting impact the best example or one of the most prominent examples of power being used within football, or vice versa? Considering the types of nation building that happened in places like Morocco and French North Africa, and considering a lot of the players who have dual nationalities, for instance, as these colonial projects and nations actually had quite a lasting impact in terms of power in football where this is concerned.
Yeah, if you allow, I would go a step back, because first of all, we have to make clear that football without colonialism would not be a global game, especially because I'm talking to a British citizen and many of British people will listen to this podcast. And this, what I wanted to explain, especially how became football an international game. It is because colonial powers like Britain, like France, like Portugal were traveling around to make their countries richer. And of course, British sailors, soldiers, they were, using their spare time in colonies to play football, cricket, rugby. I was in India, for example, which was the biggest colony of the UK, the jewel, as they called it. And I was very surprised that in India, in Calcutta, the former capital of British India, there were football clubs being older than Bayern Munich or Barcelona. And for many decades in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Indians were not allowed to found their clubs, to participate in football. They were the subordinates. And the British came and they wanted to explain the European discipline with the help of football. So at the beginning of football was power, was violence, was hierarchy. And you're right, nation building, when football was so popular and so great, and the Indians, even though they were reduced as citizens of second class in India, they still liked the game. They still wanted to play football. And at one point, they played football, and at their clubs, they were like organizing against British. There was one, if you go to India and if you mention the year 1911, and 1911 was the first time an Indian team was beating a British military team. Mohun Bagan, the club is called, Mohun Bagan, in 1911. There are poems written about it, films are telling the stories, books are written about it. So in the logic of the Indian people, at least in Kolkata, the movement of independence started with a football match, right? Of course, it's romanticized, it's a myth. But there you go. From a colonial sport, it became a post-colonial sport. And this is interesting. And you can go to the nations you just mentioned, Morocco, North Africa, nation building, Congo, Egypt, right? The African Cup of Nations in the 50s, 60s were a part of this movement. So there we go. Football became a post-colonial sport, and even FIFA could do marketing about this now, but they don't.
Yeah, I know. I get it. It's there's so much more that should be done to obviously raise awareness and talk about this, as is the case with colonialism in different institutions around the world. I think it's interesting though, because whenever we talk about football, obviously we talk about, as you mentioned at the beginning there, without colonialism, football would not be a global game. And it's through the byproduct of it being used as a nation building technique and through other means that we've actually got this case where players in France can declare for example, the Ivory Coast or vice versa. Players in Portugal can declare for Brazil or vice versa. And that's one of the things that colonialism obviously brought and what its lasting legacy is. So we'll touch on that a little bit more once we've kind of covered some more ideas around power, because I'm quite keen to explore this idea further. And one of the ways I wanted to do it was through some specific examples of clubs who have done it, whether that be through the supporters and fan groups, which featured quite prominent, well, it featured very prominently in power players, or through clubs actually leveraging power for themselves, whether that's to influence fans or people within the governments of the associations that they play in.
Yeah, the most concrete example comes to mind. I did a big chapter in the current book, Football and Racism, about France and Algeria, which you mentioned. So remember that Algeria was controlled by France for more than 130 years. And when France finally, or when Algeria finally started the independence movement, it was very bloody. There was a war, and there were like French Algerian players playing in France. And secretly, a few of them returned to Algeria. They created a team, an independence team, traveling the world, and they were looking for attention for the independence movement. And so there was, you can call it an independence football team. And even now, 50, 60 years later, you have stadiums named after players. You have pitches named after this team. The Algerian anthem was a song the players used to sing back then. But in Cairo, in Tunis, in Marrakesh, football fans back then were helping. They had their specific songs, they had their lyrics, and because the football was such a accessible tool and platform where people were mingling and helped independence movements, especially in Africa.
Yeah, and it's through these kind of ideas. This is where heritage kind of really plays a big part. And a lot of the conversations we've had in this podcast so far have been around, heritage through the lens of identity, through the lens of, the remnants of old stadiums and lost football clubs in memory, and so on and so forth. But I haven't really done much discussion on heritage as a political tool. And for our listeners who aren't aware, heritage is very heavily politicised. It's something that's used almost every day in our political discourse, particularly recently within the UK. And in Scotland as well, of course. So it's something that is very heavily politicised. And when we talk about power and people using football for the means of power or to leverage power, quite often heritage is used.
The basic narrative that football and sports told us for more than a century is that football and sport brings people together. It was almost invented by Jules Rimet, one of the founders of the World Cup, or Pierre de Coubertin, who was the founder of the International Olympic Committee. These people, French citizens, but other British citizens, they were like on the peak of colonialism in the early 20th century. And they defined what does it mean to bring people together, football as a tool. But of course, it's very easy for them when they are French or British aristocrats, and African and Asian teams were not allowed to join a World Cup and the Olympics much later, many decades later. So they started a debate from a position of privileged white Europeans. And it has never been integration through sport. It was always integration through success. Only when you're successful, you are a part of the team. You can ask Marcus Rashford or Karim Benzema or Mesut Özil still in the present period of time. And talking about nations, interestingly, I was in Portugal, for example. We forget that Portugal was responsible for 2/3 of the transatlantic slave trade. So we estimate that maybe 2/3 of the 12 million people that were taken against their will from Africa, Portugal is responsible for that. And Portugal nowadays does not belong to the wealthiest countries of the European Union. But back then, till the 60s, 70s, Portugal was sending, back then the regime was sending its most famous clubs to the African colonies, Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde. A player like Eusebio, player of the century in Portugal, when he died a few years ago, you can read the Portuguese media and they said, oh, this poor, simple, humble black boy from Mozambique, he made all the goals and he deserved to be a Portuguese citizen, right? There is this underlying racist tone. And so the prestige, the success, the reputation of the Portuguese football nation is based on players from colonies as well. But we don't really question that. To this day, in Portugal, racism and the colonial past is not discussed enough. They call it nation building, but nowadays you don't really ask the people that suffer of racism or discrimination, but they were used for the narrative of nation building.
Yeah, I think the Eusebio example is really good actually, because another form of power that colonial nations used, particularly in the case with Portugal and Mozambique, was that they actually had sporting academies placed in different countries, and they weren't really subtle about it either. It was, Sporting Mozambique or Benfica Mozambique. And what people don't realise is that, yes, you can always say that these players went to these academies and were able to develop their game potentially to a level they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. But in many ways, this caused a huge talent drain and a brain drain from these different nations that were being colonised. And all of it was being centralised within the colonial superpower.
Yeah, some people would disagree, right? If you go look to India, there are some conservative, even British politicians or scholars, and they say, yeah, but we brought them streets, we brought them factories, the Indians couldn't breed without us. When you go into specifics, you can see that even, there were roads being built or train stations, but sometimes only the British factories benefited from them, or they got the resources and then the clothes and were produced in the UK and then even sold back to India. It is complicated, but going back to football, yes. For example, in Brazil, I've been in Brazil as well. There are talent schools where you only create small clubs, not to be successful, not to build a fan base, no, to find talents that you then can sell to European clubs.
Commodity.
And I met people that said, oh, the old slavery tradition is still in football. I mean, I wouldn't go that far to use this term, but you're right. So you see all this inequality. You can see now. I was in Namibia, the former colony of Germany, and just got the independence in 1990, so relatively late. And all these countries, there's a high inequality, which is one result of colonialism. But Namibia, other places, there's a high corruption. And you can't blame only colonialism, but it is a hypothetical question. We never really will get the clear answer. What would have happened? How could these countries, if the British, the Portuguese, the French never would have arrived? We don't really get the answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. Another example, just off the top of my head quickly as well, was the Italian club, Spal, I think it was, who went under a transfer embargo because they effectively were prosecuted under human trafficking laws because they kept signing, I think it was young, very young, like under the age of 16, footballing talents, they called them, from different places within Africa, I think specifically Angola and Nigeria. But these guys never made it to the field. And, that's obviously a very, very direct and a very blatant use of power that ended up in exploitation,
Yeah, but it's complicated, right? For example, when Benfica Lisbon a few years ago won the first title after many years, people in Mozambique or Angola were storming on the street and were celebrating it. So Benfica Lisbon is more popular in Mozambique than Barcelona or Liverpool. Or if you go to India, I mean, they liked it. Not as much as in the UK, but cricket is the national sport in India. Football is popular. So it is a sport brought by the colonial masters. So this is maybe one of the only accepted heritages, that's if you want to use this term, of the colonial powers, which might overshadow all the violence, all the exploitation. It's interesting. Or history. Look, last year the Africa Cup of Nations took place in, I think, in the Ivory Coast, and I was researching a story on migration among the 600 or 700 players participating in that Africa Cup. I think 1/3, or at least a high number of players, grew up in Europe, especially in France. So football federations in former colonies like Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Senegal, they have a very professional recruitment, sending scouts to France, to Belgium, to the Netherlands, to the UK. And look, maybe there are children or grandchildren from people that immigrated, right? So the old colonial networks, they're still there, but now at least the African nations, they want to have a piece of their cake as well. Morocco stormed into the semifinals of the World Cup 2022. 2/3 of the players grew up in Europe, right? So it is a bit of a twist. And maybe not the next World Cup, but at one point, I think an African nation will maybe win the World Cup.
Yeah, no, it's quite interesting, and it leads us quite nicely on to national teams as well. We can't forget that a lot of these countries, and you know, we had a Tongan international on the show towards the end of last year as well, and he said that the majority, if not all of those players, they aren't born on the island. And this is what a lot of countries, particularly like smaller island nations like Tonga, are having to do, is send out scouts to different places where their diasporas are known to be, to actually get players to come to the island and play for the national team. And again, there's power associated with that as well. They're saying to people, well, you know, we see you playing amateur football and whatever it is you are, come and play for your national team. But like you said there, it can also be in the inverse, where former colonised nations are actually seeing who they can bring to their team from, for example, the French leagues to the Ivory Coast, to see if there's players that they can entice back to what they would say, well, why don't you come home and play here if you're not going to get a look in France? So it's actually really interesting how national teams can use it as well, and in turn, of course, be used, as you touched on, in power players.
For me, one of the interesting chapters I did was in England, the so-called Windrush generation, this ship that arrived in the late 40s in England, bringing around 500 people from the Caribbean islands, and many of the children and grandchildren became successful footballers. And if you remember John Barnes or Sol Campbell, you name it, Raheem Sterling, so they were successful footballers, and even more successful than politicians or bosses of big companies. In football, they were visible. But interestingly, and this is one very important topic of my book, that one of the consequences, of the long-term consequences of colonialism, is still this old stereotype of white intellectual superiority and black physical superiority, because this is what is still in many people's minds since 300, 400 years. The white people, they are the decision makers, and the black people, they are physically advantaged, and they should work for us. And this is a provocative sentence, but you can see it in football to this day, that we celebrate the black bodies, but the decision makers, the board members, the manager of the Premier League, the journalist. I'm a white man. I never have to be scared of racism, and maybe it was easier for me to become a journalist. But if you look at the sports journalists in the UK, in France, and even look at the fan stands, the stadiums, the diverse society of London, Manchester, Birmingham is not reflected at all in the stands of the stadiums. And there are reasons for that. And I try to discuss them in my book. And it's maybe a little bit painful to think about this. If you live in a former colonial nation, Germany was at one point the third biggest colonial power in the world. So we started too many world wars. So then we had other bad topics in history that overshadow this. But yeah, Germany as well was at one point had colonies. So this is a topic that football has to touch and to tackle.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's a really good point you've made there, actually, the idea that all black players are physical and athletic. They can either run fast or they can be like a bruiser. That's the ideas and all these preconceptions that people have. It is a form of racial profiling, isn't it? And it's these ideas that are put in our head. And on the opposite end, everyone's always quick to jump on black players for being lazy. And that's the one that gets thrown around or not, or they don't work hard enough. And of course, we saw what happened in the aftermath of the Euro 2021 Euros when the England players missed the penalties as well, the black England players, I should say.
Right, there's a double standard. When there's a black player like Raheem Sterling buying a house for his mother, then how he's wasting all this money. And when there's a white player doing it, then he's such a nice guy. But you have many examples. And the UK, other than Germany, other than Portugal or France, there are a lot of good studies and books written about this already. I was very impressed. I was traveling more than 4 weeks in England for my research, and there's no country in Europe and no country in the world where you have so many self-empowerment networks. You have Football Blacklist, you have a media network, the Black Collective of Media and Sports. I was in Birmingham in the stadium of Aston Villa. There were 150 black and ethnic minority referees. Why do they meeting among each other? Because they want to feel safe and welcoming at one point, where they feel as this is a safe space where they have a louder voice against the established structures. So this is a big plus in the UK. On the other hand, there is a lot of fatigue as well. So in England, it was quite difficult to find people to interview, not only prominent footballers, but former footballers. It wasn't that easy. But at the end, I was very impressed by the engagement and the self-organization of former players, of activists, of journalists. So that England is far ahead. Germany and Portugal are still a lot to do.
Still a lot of work to do in that regard. That's quite interesting, actually. It is interesting to hear these things, and I will agree that, particularly in England and in Scotland as well, there's a few really important networks. Glasgow Ansar come to mind, who are a representative team for Glasgow's Asian community, and a number of other similar initiatives. Dreams FC, I think another one is called, and Scoutable United. Scoutable United are really interesting. It's effectively a social initiative where young black players who've come through different academies and might not have the necessary skills to be able to work elsewhere, or might not be able to seek a life out with football if all they've known is football in academies, go to Scoutable United. And yeah, they play football and then they go off elsewhere. So it's giving people a chance if, when they come out of these footballing environments, they might not have the skills that they would have got if they'd studied or whatever else. So there's all these different support networks that crop up, and they're obviously very positive things. Just to come back to the idea of power, it's not always used by football clubs or governments or different associations. It can also be by the fans as well. And that was probably one of my favourite parts about Power Players, was the focus on the fan or ultra-led or supporter-led organisations and groups that actually used power to make meaningful change within their countries.
True. Change is always relative. And for me, as a neutral reporter coming from another country and talking to people and observing that, I found in all the countries I traveled to influential and powerful football fans. Sometimes I felt sympathetic with them. I liked that. Sometimes I did not, or I didn't understand. But to name Istanbul, the protest, the Gezi Park against Erdogan, fans in Istanbul that were protesting, and later on, for example, Erdogan, he didn't want to allow that Besiktas Istanbul, with this critical fan base, getting a new stadium. Egypt, we mentioned during the Arab Spring. But for example, I was in Bilbao, in the Basque country, or Barcelona, where you remember a few years ago, where the fans supported the independence movement of Catalonia and the Basque country. For me, I was wondering, is it necessary? You are in a democratic country. Is it something different? But yeah, so be it. If they want to use the megaphone of football. This is an interesting example. A few weeks ago, I was in Hong Kong, former crown colony of the UK, but in the last years, more and more under Chinese repression. And we do remember the umbrella movement, and we do remember the big protests in 2020 when more than 1 million people of Hong Kong, more than 1/5 of the society, were demonstrating against the Chinese repression. Football is not a gigantic sport in Hong Kong, but at least it has a stadium. And there was a national team of Hong Kong another point. Hong Kong is not really a big state, but it has its own national team. No, and
Yeah.
the fans nowadays, if they would boo the Chinese anthem, they could go to prison or they get a very expensive fee. They did boo the national anthem a few years ago, but not allowed anymore. So how can you express protest nowadays? It's impossible to do it like in Egypt. So they, for example, used it. There were like 47 activists were. There was a court case against 47 pro-democratic activists. What did the ultras do? They were standing up the 47th minute of the game, applauding, and surrounded by policemen, civil guards of the secret police or whatever. But these are the subtle, the hidden ways of protesting nowadays. And when I travel as a journalist coming from a very free country, I can say what I want. And I was in Egypt, I was in China, I was in Hong Kong, I was in Rwanda. It's always a bit, how can they do it? No, I can take my passport and I fly home again, but they have to live in a society where it's not free, where it's dangerous. And football, and even if they don't protest, football, it feels at least anonymous. They are among their peers. They can celebrate, they can be joyful. So it is an important platform to just feel relaxed. And if they protest, okay. But if not, then it's probably too dangerous.
Absolutely is. And for a lot of people within the nations you've mentioned and others across the world who face repression or where the people face repression, football's one of the only means that they've got to actually express themselves, and they can do it through this idea of being part of a united support or, within, I suppose, heritage jargon, you'd call it the psychology of the mob or the psychology of the group. It is really important though, because it gives people, and this is where stadiums, I always talk about stadiums as being, like cultural hubs. This is the idea behind it, is that stadiums become these places where these different expressions and identities are made known so prominently, even in nations which are heavily repressed. But of course, on the other side of things as well, you've got, and Argentina was one of the examples that always sticks out in my mind. And until I read Power Players, I actually wasn't aware of the influence of ultras groups in Argentina, where their ties to the government, their ties to the mafia, drug dealing, criminal activity, and even just down to selling tickets as well, that blew my mind. So of course, on the other side of it, you've also got ultras using power as a way to actually make money and engage in different activities and illicit activities.
Yeah, it's an ecosystem, right? Argentina is drastic, and we can't even imagine. But Serbia as well. People going to war. If you, I have never been to Colombia, but I want to go to Colombia one day, where football fans as well are connected to drug cartels or to using it. Or, but it's interesting that you mentioned the term nation. Yeah, it's nation building, but one of a few football, I think 18 members of FIFA, they are not even a nation. If you look at the Palestinian football team, it is not a state recognized by the United Nations, but they have their own national team. And now, after 1.5 years of the war, I had an interview recently with the vice president of the Palestinian football team. The stadium is destroyed in Gaza. The stadium was used as an internment camp by the Israeli military. So I think more than 300 football players were killed. The national players, they had to stay abroad. Otherwise, maybe would have been difficult to travel within the West Bank. So as sad and disastrous as this is, they could use at least the football team to have a little bit of positive news in this catastrophe. And we can jump from one country to the other, from one nation territories to the other. It's everywhere related to that. So it's cool that you have a whole podcast about this topic. It's extraordinary.
It's the types of things that I like talking about it, and my friends and our other contributors will tell you I can talk about this for days. And it was quite interesting that you mentioned the Basque Country earlier on, because we've had some socios who are members of Athletic Bilbao on this show before, and that led to a big deep dive into the history of football within the Basque Country. And like you said at the time, Athletic Bilbao to the world, in my opinion, is the representative of Basque football because of their signing policy. For our listeners, if you're not aware, their signing policy is that they only sign players who are born or raised within the Basque Country. that's what ties them to be the representative of Basque football. But then on the other hand, you've got Real Sociedad who say, their fans might say, well, no, we're the true representative of football in the Basque country. And then you've got other teams who might say the same thing. But if you go further back, there was a team who ended up playing within the Mexican first division called CD Euskadi, which is the Basque language name for the Basque country. And they had to play in Mexico because General Franco and his Falanges government banned them from playing as a nation. And it's interesting that you then bring up this idea of nation, Ronnie, because when I was speaking to Aotor, who was one of our guests on our podcast, he actually said, well, when I asked about the signing policy, and I said, well, why doesn't the Basque country look to the diaspora, for example, who live in Chile and Argentina and other places in South America? He said, well, because we don't have passports. Yes, we support this idea of a Basque nation, but legally and legitimately, we can't enforce something like that because technically, if you look at, in terms of legality surrounding national status, the Basque country doesn't exist. So how can we have a diaspora? How can we therefore try and sign players who are part of a diaspora that to FIFA isn't something that exists?
There's even a whole football federation for nations that are recognized, CONIFA, and they have their own tournament, European and worldwide. You have Kurdish people, you have so many other peoples that are not recognized, but at least they use the football national team to create some headlines. And there's so many stories always popping up that I would like to research or jump into it. The Basque country, I mean, Bilbao is a beautiful city, but I think it's a bit of a romanticization, right? When you only look at the local players or players from the diaspora, then it means you exclude a lot of other players. So, but I don't want to judge it. But you remember the ETA terrorism, right? For a few decades and years, it was very deadly and dangerous in the Basque country, and there were like examples where the club or fans that didn't really criticize that, and there were even like words heard on the stands like celebrating the ETA terror. So there's always at least I as a journalist, when I hear something like that, the story is too good, right? We have a football club. We are more than 80 years in the first league, only with players from our local environment. Wow. So I accept that, but then there must be something behind that. So always try to find all angles and just describing it and leaving the opinion to the reader. But you're right, it's a fascinating topic.
Yeah, and I can imagine that through your journalism work, you must have. This is ultimately what these books span from, is your work looking at these stories, and like yourself, I'm the same in terms of this podcast. When I hear something like that, and I hear about a story, and it's trying to dig into those deeper themes for me of heritage and identity, and for yourself of power and the different relationships that power actually has with different clubs and national teams around the world. Of course, we've probably not touched on the two biggest examples recently. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is a very, very obvious one of how they've used power, very blatant, very obvious, and throwing money at the game, and it's part of their government's sort of next round of planning that sport becomes a huge part of legitimising them. But of course, there's the Premier League as well, and I feel like when these kind of discussions are had, the Premier League, at the very best, always gets a bit of a slap in the wrist and just lets go, and there's not a lot of discussion around how the Premier League actually took power and centralised it and still uses it to this day.
Both topics are actually connected. If you look at Saudi Arabia, we talk always about sports washing, which insinuates that Saudi Arabia is only doing it to impress us in Europe. But I was in Saudi Arabia for research, and I think it wasn't the case. Saudi Arabia does it mainly for its internal transformation. This country is heavily dependent on oil imports, but at one point, this history will be over. So they want to create tourism, they want to create new economical networks, and they use football as a platform to attract investors, tourists, and other companies. And especially in a society which is very, very young, which was excluded, which had no fun in decades, they want to motivate especially the young part of society to have some fun, to have identification with Crown Prince. So the old contract of society is, we give you something, but please don't be politically active. We do the things. If you are asking for political participation, you're not going to get it. So, and I was surprised when I was at the Derby in Riyadh watching Ronaldo and Neymar. Pyrotechnics, so fireworks were allowed. It was an impressive atmosphere, and there were ultras with megaphones, and they're not political, but they're very, very colorful and loud. So this is one topic. And there's another one. We in the Western world, the UK, Germany, France, what do you think in Qatar, World Cup host 2022? What do you think who bought the new metro, the hotels, the stadiums? German architects, German companies. So we benefited from that as well. And this will be the case in the World Cup in 2034. And now we're at the Premier League, Newcastle United, where Saudi Arabia is now the big player. And they're not only doing it because they want to have some prestige, they want to use football to create networks, contact with local politicians. Newcastle is the harbor city. You have contact to the sea. You can create, you can build. Yeah, and like Qatar did it in France or in the UK, they use football for geopolitical networks, like Gazprom, the Russian state oil and gas company. They went to became a big sponsor, Red Star Belgrade, Schalke 04, Champions League, because they wanted to lay a path to oil and gas deals in the casual stadium. And yeah, this Saudi Arabia does it very, very smart, and we can make fun of it, and we can do outragement. But if we want to change football, then our football federations need to build alliances among the 200 members. Then they can change FIFA. But just frustration and anger in a few European countries will not, unfortunately, not be enough.
Yeah, no, it's spot on, and Gazprom could be that could be a whole separate podcast on itself in terms of the power that Gazprom used and the influence that it brought. Serbia, obviously, you mentioned there importantly, but was it Schalke they used to sponsor in Germany?
Just a few weeks after the war began in February 2022, Gazprom was kicked out. They were kicked out from Schalke. They were kicked out from Champions League. I think maybe they still sponsored Red Star Belgrade, but Alexander Vucic, the Serbian president, he is pretty close to Putin. But other than that, Russia is excluded. I mean, at least superficially, but of course, the networks are still there. The officials are still talking to each other. And even Putin nowadays creates its own football tournaments and using footballers for its propaganda shows. So still there, it's happening.
Yeah, that's right. It was just interesting what you said towards the end there about Saudi Arabia. As I remember once I was speaking to someone about it, and I says, it's... And it just kind of rolled off my tongue, and then it sort of clicked in my head after my friend rightfully called me out for it. I said, so for context, when the SFA said that they were relaxing the rules on Scottish clubs being bought over in minority stakes, one of the first things I said was, the last thing that I want is the SPFL turning into a Saudi-run league. And my friend said, well, how different is that from Americans buying it or English businessmen buying it? Then I realised I was like, well, that's actually true. And that's my fault for being ignorant to the fact that this has happened in football for decades. It's not just Saudi Arabia or Saudi businessmen that are buying on it. Yes, there's a different element because some of these corporations are state-owned, but ultimately, it's not really different from an American businessman buying your club or an English businessman or a Chinese businessman or state-run organisation. It's all the same power that's all consolidated in the same places to a certain degree. When a lot of people are talking about it, there's already... there's all this opposition towards Saudi-backed ownership, but then a lot of people need to maybe look at their own club's ownerships before they decide what it is they're actually opposing in that case.
Yeah, and Newcastle is a good example to explain that as well. I did a story on the very active local civil society network that is criticizing the Saudi influence. And for them, over the years, it became more and more difficult to talk to local MPs because the UK and European nations, we do depend on Saudi Arabia, not because of the oil and gas, but look, it's a very fragile, volatile region. Saudi Arabia is a stable country, and if you look at the Taliban and if you look at the war in Israel, for negotiations, countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia became more and more important. And I even talked to a journalist of the local newspaper in Newcastle, and he says it as well. He wants to be critical. He wants to reflect on that. But maybe it's difficult at one point to get interviews with the coach of Newcastle or the fan base is happy with Saudi Arabia when the club is successful. You have to balance this out. No, for a newspaper that loses subscribers and ads, then this is all complicated. So as you say, and the companies are intertwined anyways. No, these big companies. Look, now the German car industries that are losing its revenues because in China it's complicated. Football is a mirror of this complication.
Yeah, China is a really complicated one, as we saw. I think within the last 6 months, we certainly spoke about it briefly towards the end of last year, the collapse of the Evergrande group, and that subsequently taking Guangzhou Evergrande with them. The one thing I did actually want to ask you, because it's actually been in my mind since I read Power Players, and it's been touched on by a couple of other authors as well. I think Chris Lee and James Montague. A lot of people make the comparison between Saudi Arabia and China, and obviously they'll say, oh, well, we don't need to worry about Saudi Arabia because, and again, that term worry being used in a negative sense because, the Chinese Super League crashed and burned, but it's completely different, isn't it? They're not really comparable in that sense.
10 years ago, we had similar stories on China and Xi Jinping, who wanted to become a football champion, and there's very positive stories. Let's put it another way, like Saudi Arabia, some of the players are already not really satisfied anymore. Neymar left, Benzema wanted to go, some other players left. But again, important is that when you travel in Saudi Arabia, the people have a pride. They identify themselves with the crown prince. If you look at the society, my impression was that among the society, the crown prince is relatively progressive. So there are parts of society that don't want women to drive. They don't want women being in labor. And Saudi Arabia does it because of the transformation. The crown prince has to do it because he might lose power otherwise if he can't keep up the wealth for a high percentage of the society. And for China, it was a bit different because it has already transformed its economy. Maybe for them it was more like a tool to be part of the Western power structure. So I would agree with you. There are different angles, but there are similarities as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those things, and again, I think it's important that people are always quick to call it out because there are always going to be a few similarities where power is concerned. Ultimately, they're completely different, and governments and organisations will always have different motives for doing these things. This has been a great chat, Ronny. Just before we finish things up, do you want to talk about your new book a little bit? Give it a plug so that some of our listeners can pick it up.
Yeah, so Football and Racism, How Colonialism Shaped the Modern Game was, for me, it was an intense ride. I traveled on 5 continents, 9 countries, and Brazil, for example, I was since 2 weeks in Sao Paulo, a country that was always proud that they did not have racial segregation, at least not in law. They did not have an apartheid, but of course, it's still a racist society. But they, for example, said, we had Pelé. We had the most successful football player. He was black. How can we be a racist country? Of course, there is racism to this day. I learned a lot. And if we want to talk about England, which I'm very attached to this country, but when I'm browsing through the Waterstones bookstores in London and I see this, there's so many books about racism and colonialism, and then I see some studies where seemingly big percentage of British society knows more about Henry VIII than colonialism. So there is still a lack there. And if you remember Boris Johnson or other conservative politicians, Theresa May, that said, come on, it wasn't that bad. No, the world is speaking English, so it was quite good. So I would love to bring this discussion to England. I had many lectures in Germany, more than 60 lectures, and we're talking about racism in Germany. It's painful, especially in times where more and more right-wing governments come into power. And this is a debate that will never end. And in my book, maybe one last sentence, I try to give publicity to the many people that are active against racism, that use football as a tool for diversity. So I even I'm a journalist. I don't want to be only negative, and I want to be, even in that dark field, very optimistic. And yeah, hopefully the reader agree.
Absolutely, and I would encourage any of our readers to pick it up as well. I still need to pick it up and read it because it broaches on so many topics that I'm interested in. And one that, just a last word on, before we finish up, there's so much to be said about Scottish exceptionalism, and from what we've heard from particularly the SNP over the last, up until a certain point, certainly over the last decade or so, was that, it was England that was a colonial empire, and it was the British mindset that done it. But Scotland had a huge role in colonialism in the British Empire. I mean, not Northern Ireland, Ulster Scots, that's because it was a Scottish colony. And I think the most prominent example for me is that through the Scottish Football Association recently, and through research, it found that Andrew Watson, who captained Scotland in their 6-1 win over England, was, at the time of speaking, was world football's first black football captain and world's first black, what would become association football player. And the SFA are keen to talk about that. But what they're not keen to talk about is the fact that Andrew Watson was born in British Guiana to a Scottish father who was the owner of the plantation, and a Guianese mother who worked for him. It doesn't take a rocket science to know what's going on there in terms of the relationship between those two individuals, but it's never spoken about how colonialism plays a part in this. Do you see where I'm coming from? So it's yes, this is a great story, but there has to be a wider discussion about where this came from, and Scotland's role in this as well, which ultimately works like your book and the works that other people are putting out there are looking to do, is break down these ideas and actually broach new subjects within football, which is important to our understanding of the game.
True, totally agree. And I was really searching for even visible symbols. Yeah, I was. There was, for example, in the Slavery Museum in Liverpool, there's one poster remembering the first black footballer, the Black History. I think it's called the Black History Archives in Brixton in London. But there's not much. You have to search for the visible symbols. And maybe one important thought, because my book is not only about the visible and loud racism, it's about the hidden racism, the overemphasization of black physicality, which does not exist. It's a myth, and media that are emphasizing these stereotypes, so-called blackfacing, right? When young kids do black color in their face to celebrate black footballers, which is racist as well. So most of the racism is hidden, and we don't really question it, and it has sometimes a positive motivation behind it, right? There are many examples, and I think the debate has just started.
Yeah, absolutely, and we can only hope that more works are added to the body of literature that's being released on it as well. But to all our listeners, thank you very much for tuning into the show. Ronny, thank you very much for joining me. It's been a long time coming, this conversation, and I'm delighted that I've finally been able to have it with you. So thank you very much for your time. To all our listeners, if there's anything that you want to ask about this episode, or if there's any topics you want to suggest to us, then please do get in touch. You can DM us on X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk as well. But for now, Ronny, say goodbye.
Rory, thank you very much for having me.
It's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.